Donald Trump's attacks on the Fed are not just about its chairman, Jerome Powell. In fact, they're not really about Jerome Powell at all. The attacks are about whether we still believe America's central bank should be insulated from political interference. It's about turning one of the most trusted financial institutions in the world into a partisan weapon. And it's understandable if you don't think that much about the Fed at all. But the consequences of Trump's relentless attacks on Powell are more dangerous than many Americans realize. The Federal Reserve is not like most other government agencies. It wasn't designed to dance to the tune of presidents or follow the ups and downs of election cycles. It, like many central banks around the world, was explicitly designed to resist the short-term whims of politicians and elections. Its core mission is to stabilize prices and to promote maximum employment. It does that by setting interest rates and ensuring financial stability. Its job is highly technical, long-term, and grounded in pretty specific economic data, not late-night tirades on Truth Social. The Fed's independence is no accident. It's the product of decades of hard-learned lessons when politicians try to wrench control of monetary policy, which influences the supply of money, separate from fiscal policy, which concerns taxes and government spending. When that happens, it can result in recessions, runaway inflation, shattered markets, and broken public trust. Look at authoritarian regimes like Turkey, where central banks have been effectively taken over by politicians. Inflation in Turkey soared as high as 85% in 2022. Economic chaos followed. That's why maintaining the Fed's independence is absolutely critical. But Trump has made it clear that he wants none of that independence. He's publicly attacked Powell for refusing to slash interest rates, even though interest rate decisions are voted on by a 12-member Federal Open Market Committee. And since inflation remains a serious concern, the committee has decided that now is not the time to do the thing that Trump would find politically expedient. In fact, one of the reasons the Fed isn't cutting rates is because of Trump's erratic economic behavior. Earlier this month, Powell explained that the Fed Open Market Committee would have likely cut rates by now, if not for the economic uncertainty and inflation risks triggered by Trump's own tariff policies. Powell is not some Democratic deep state hack. Trump himself appointed Powell as chair back in 2017, a fact that he seems to have conveniently forgotten, claiming on Wednesday he was surprised that Biden had appointed him. Just a hunch, but I think what actually surprises Trump is that someone he appointed as chair isn't willing to bark on command. Powell has repeatedly stated that Trump is not legally permitted to remove him except for cause before Powell's term ends in May of 2026. You can be pretty certain that Powell will be gone by then. But behind closed doors, Trump's allies are already drafting plans to remove Powell before his term even ends. And to justify this otherwise illegal power grab, they're pointing to a construction renovation project. The Fed is in the middle of a $2.5 billion update to its 100-year-old headquarters in Washington, an upgrade that began in 2021. And like many large projects, it's gone over budget by about $700 million. Trump is now using that cost overrun as a pretext, floating vague accusations of fraud and claiming Powell could be fired for cause. Let's be absolutely clear. This is all political theater. For one thing, the Federal Reserve is not funded by taxpayers. Its operations are funded by interest that it receives on government securities that it owns, an intentional part of its design that helps it maintain its independence. Powell has already asked the Fed's Inspector General to review the renovation in full. Still, Trump is smearing Powell with schoolyard insults, calling him a knucklehead and a very stupid person, because the Fed hasn't slashed its key lending rate to below 1%, a significant move that would artificially juice the economy and likely fuel inflation. Currently, the federal funds rate, the Fed's benchmark rate against which the rates you pay or earn interest is based, sits between 4.25% and 4.5%. Now, that reflects economic realities, not political preferences. Under federal law, Fed chair can only be removed for cause, meaning serious misconduct like fraud or dereliction of duty, not a policy disagreement or schoolyard bullying. Legal experts across the spectrum agree that Trump doesn't have a valid case here, and if he tries, Powell can fight back. He's entitled to due process, including a formal notice, a hearing, and the opportunity to challenge the firing in court. Now, this has never happened before, but it could happen now, and the case would almost certainly go to the Supreme Court. You may recall that in a ruling this past May, the conservative majority opened the door for presidents to remove the heads of independent agencies, such as the Federal Trade Commission and the National Labor Relations Board. But in the very same decision, the Supreme Court carved out an exception for the Fed, calling it a, quote, uniquely structured quasi-private entity with a distinct historical tradition. Now, legal scholars called that language incoherent, more of a legal fig leaf than sound constitutional logic. As Slate's Mark Joseph Stern put it, the carve-out reads like the conservative justices begging Trump, quote, please, please, please don't mess with the Fed and fire Powell because we don't want you to tank our 401k, end quote. But by issuing a ruling on shaky legal ground, the conservative justices may have backed themselves into a corner. They want to clear the way for expansive executive power, but only on their terms, carving out arbitrary exceptions that undercut their own logic. Meanwhile, Trump treats legal limits like dares, especially when they stand between him and power. And Trump, ever the connoisseur of fig leaves, will call the court's bluff by tossing one of his own right back at them. He's already pointing to the Fed's renovation cost overruns, labeling them fiscal mismanagement. He could absurdly argue that that's cause to fire Powell. And because the courts can't question his motives, thanks to last year's Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity, nothing may stand in the way of Trump's hostile takeover of the Fed. If there's one thing that defines this Supreme Court, it's handing Donald Trump power with one hand while drawing arbitrary exceptions with the other. They say he can't fire Powell over interest rates, but they also say courts can't scrutinize his reasons if he claims it's about something else. It's constitutional bait and switch. It sets a dangerous precedent. When the president wants to break an institution, all he has to do is invent a pretext. And that is how democratic norms erode, not with a single blow, but by bending one legal principle after another. Even longtime Fed critics, and there are many, like the Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, have rushed to Powell's defense, calling this a manufactured controversy. Critics agree that this is faux outrage, a setup, a blatant and embarrassing pretext by the president. But if Trump succeeds in firing Powell or stacking the Fed with loyalists, the consequences are not going to be academic. They are going to hit the prices you pay at the pump, your mortgage rate, your grocery bill. They'll ripple through the global economy. They'll shake confidence in the U.S. dollar and the economic leadership that America has spent decades building. Independent central banks exist for a reason. Countries that politicize monetary policy suffer higher inflation, greater volatility, and slower growth. A captured Fed wouldn't just be bad for Wall Street. It would be a disaster for working Americans and for the global system that we lead. Right now, Donald Trump is the biggest threat to that system, which is why his war on the Fed matters. It's not about Jerome Powell. It's about whether institutions like the Fed can stand apart from presidential power and whether every major aspect of America becomes part of one man's empire. Trump may say he won't fire Powell. He's since said that. But even if he doesn't, the writing's on the wall. With 2 seats at the Fed Open Committee likely to open soon, Trump may finally get the chance to reshape his central bank, not to serve the U.S. economy, but to serve himself, priming it to artificially boost growth for his own political gain. And that is the real and only threat facing the world's most important central bank.